Very good, very good. Kia ora koutou. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this very special broadcast regarding a very important part of the Kaipara Kickstart work in the Kai project. So for this very important piece of work, we've got a great team who are going to be presenting for you. Now we've got Brent, Nava, and Malcolm, yeah, and so it's going to be a group of extraordinary experts here who have been involved in this important piece of research, which is one of the, I'll call it one of the planks on which this original idea of the Kaipara Kickstart Kai project was built, which was a very old topoclimate study project that was done for Kaipara and the Hokianga, parts of Kaipara, not Kaipara District, just parts of Kaipara down to Ruawai. And that was done in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, that work was done. This sort of research, everybody, is, as I say, are the building blocks on which farmers, landowners, and investors can then go out and explore better the things that will grow well in the places where we all are. And of course, here in Kaipara, being the important food bowl that we know it to be, exactly research like this is core to where we are headed. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the team now. I will back out of my camera so you'll see or hear from me again, maybe until the very end of the presentation. But I'll hand over to our experts. And so everybody rise strong, kia kaha kaipara, and let's go.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. My name is Nava Fadaif, and I am a weather forecaster and climate scientist at NIWA. And I'm going to kick off the discussion here today. So let me just share my screen. One moment. Hopefully you can see that. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview of the project as a whole before we get into the three parts of the project, which involved climate, involved soil information, and then the crop suitability. So I kind of pinched this graphic from Tim from Coriolis Research from the other week when he did a great presentation, which I thought really highlights really nicely how all of this work fits under the Kaipara Kai umbrella, but also fits in with all the other amazing work being done in terms of wharves and roads. So today we're here to discuss the topoclimate study, and that was a collaborative piece of work between NIWA Plant and Food Research and Mana Ki Whenua Land Care Research. Okay, so just a brief overview of what we've done. We've been working on this for a year now, and over the course of this year, we've produced a number of reports. So there was a few interim reports by Plant and Food that were completed. There was a report on soils and soil data by Mana Ki Whenua. There was a report on current and future climate in the Kaipara District, and there was an additional note that was done that looked at future crop suitability as well. So we took all of that information and produced a summary report that you can see here. And we also produced, three infographics which summarize the information as well. So I had a look and I can see that the summary report and infographics are already available online that you can download and look at the information, which is awesome. So today we're going to talk through some of the kind of key findings, or at least introduce you to some of the content in these reports. There is a lot of information and we don't have that much time, so it's going to be very brief, but just so you know, all of that information is available to you. So I'm going to talk first about the current and future climate of the Kaipara District. And although I'm fronting this presentation, there was quite a long list of NIWA scientists that were involved in this piece of work, and they're on the screen there. So I just wanted to acknowledge them as well. So our piece of the study looked into the climate, and we looked at two parts, the current climate and potential future climate due to climate change. So the current climate, it's mostly maps and tables, such as this is a map showing average rainfall, for example, in the Kaipara District on screen. So they're mostly a resource for you to use to look at climate variability at present across the district. Might be helpful for planning and things like that. As residents of the district, I'm sure you're well aware that the climate is quite mild in the Kaipara, humid, windy at times, and that's largely because of the northern location, quite a low elevation, and your proximity to the sea. Frosts are very far and few in between, and rainfall is generally plentiful, but you do get the heavy rainfalls and periods of dryness and drought, as we found out this year. As part of the work, we looked at the New Zealand Drought Index, and this is the New Zealand Drought Index for the Kaipara District that we're seeing on screen now. And it's from 2007 till April 2020. So we can see that Kaipara does regularly observe periods of drought, and there have been several severe droughts since 2007, one being this summer and continuing beyond that, and also the other one being in 2013. I'm not going to talk about current climate too much because I'd like to focus on future climate. And this is one of the big changes in terms of that early report that the Mayor just mentioned that we did in the early 2000s. Our modeling in terms of future climate wasn't as sophisticated as it is now. So it's quite timely that we're able to provide this updated information, as we just have so much more information available to share. So before I talk about the actual projections for the Kaipara District, I thought I'd take you behind the Niwa curtain and give you a bit of an insight into how we actually predict future climate. So we have a talented team of modelers that use computer models to simulate the climate. So essentially they're mathematical reconstructions of our atmosphere that take into account things like the atmospheric circulation, ocean currents, solar radiation, and of course, greenhouse gases. So these simulations give us an idea of what climate change might be like under different scenarios in the future. So global climate models have a resolution of about 250 kilometers. And that's pretty coarse, as you can imagine. And so at Niwa, we take that information and we use our supercomputer to do what's called downscaling. So we get it to a finer resolution, which is 30 kilometers for a regional climate model. And then we take that information and make it finer again at a 5-kilometer resolution. So that is the data that is the backbone of the future climate projections used in this project. And it was also, we provided this information to Plant and Food to look into future crop suitability as well. When we look at potential future climate, one of the big uncertainties in models is actually what are the greenhouse gas concentrations going to be like in the future. And that all comes down to what kind of globally humans do. So in this project, we looked at 2 potential pathways, and everything in between is also a potential pathway as well. But we just wanted to do a snapshot of 2 potential pathways so you can see what that might be. One is a more extreme pathway where greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise at current rates, and what we call a mid-range pathway where there may be global efforts to heavily reduce emissions and the greenhouse gas concentrations actually stabilize. So I'll use that kind of pathway language a little bit, and that's the basis for it. So what do we know about the future climate in the Kaipara District? So by the end of the century, we know that the average temperature is going to be warmer everywhere, and it's projected to rise by about 1 degree under that mid-range pathway I mentioned. But if little action is taken to reduce emissions, it will be more like 2.5 degrees on average across the region. There's a few seasonal changes there as well. That might not sound like much. I mean, the daily temperature varies by many more degrees than that in a day. But I guess to give you some context, during the last ice age, the average temperature was just 5 degrees cooler than at present. So it's actually that small change in average temperature can have quite significant impacts. So to better understand these impacts, one other thing that we do and that we have provided in this report is we look at how do extreme temperatures change? So we looked at hot days and also heat wave days in the report. And this map on these maps on the right there show annual changes in hot days. Now, hot days we define as days where temperatures exceed 25 degrees. And for example, in Dargaville, there are about 30 hot days per year on average at the moment. And if we look into the future on, say, the left-hand column of that hot days 4-panel map, that's about the 2040 that we're looking at there. And both of the pathways have quite a similar projection. In fact, we're expecting about 20 more hot days by 2040 under both scenarios. But then when we jump further into the future, so by the end of the century, you start to really see the difference those two scenarios make. So under the mid-range pathway, we are expecting in Dargaville up to 40 extra hot days on the 30 that we currently have. And under that extreme scenario, we see potentially an additional 70 hot days. So you can see that kind of our actions at the moment will make a big difference in the near future, but especially by the end of the century. So when we're kind of using this information for planning, we need to think about, well, are these assets or decisions, what's their life cycle? You know, how long is it? How far into the future should we be looking, and what climate change projections should we perhaps consider when making these decisions? So in terms of impacts for temperatures, there are many, and once again, a lot of this is detailed in the report, but in terms of horticulture, some of the impacts can include that increasing temperatures can affect the phenological development of plants, which may happen faster. So for example, things like bud burst and flowering and fruit development may happen at different times. And we actually saw an example of that in the hottest summer that we've had recently, which was in 2017 and 18. A lot of wine grapes in New Zealand ripened faster than usual, and for Central Otago, their Pinot Noir grapes was the earliest harvest on record, and it was a whole month earlier. So we're kind of seeing what a future warmer climate, the impacts of that already, and these things will become more common in the future. There may be positive impacts because of warmer temperatures, so which perhaps Brent will touch on as well, but warmer temperatures mean that we can diversify our crops and maybe grow things that were previously not so suitable in the Kaipara District that all of a sudden become more suitable. So it's not all bad news, but with the warmer temperatures, you can also get increase in the number of pests and diseases that were maybe before limited by cold conditions that are no longer, such as we've had the Queensland fruit fly, for example, come to our shores more often recently. So there's definitely challenges, but there's also opportunities with some of these projections. A quick look at rainfall. So when we look at rainfall, it's quite interesting. When we look at rainfall amount in a whole year, there doesn't seem like there's going to be much change in the amount of water in a whole year. But then when you start to break it down and look seasonally, you actually see that the biggest change in terms of rainfall due to climate change will be in the seasonality of rainfall. And it is winter and spring that are looking like they're going to be drier by the end of the century in the Kaipara District. So that was kind of an interesting outcome. The number of days without rain, or dry days, I should say, are expected to be more common and more severe in the Kaipara District. That will also increase pressure on our freshwater resources, and which will, of course, impact agriculture and horticulture. So somewhat unintuitively, because of our warming atmosphere, there's actually, it's projected that there will be more extreme rainfall events, or that let me rephrase it. When we have rain, there's going to be, the rain will be more extreme. So just as an example, let's backtrack. So because our warmer atmosphere can hold more energy and moisture, when it does rain, that same event in the future will produce more rainfall. So for example, right now in Dargaville, a 1 in 100 year rainfall event will deliver 45 millimeters of rain in 24 hours. So that's just kind of an average of how much rain would fall out of an event like that. In the future, a 1 in 100 year rainfall event in Dargaville will deliver 61 millimeters of rain. So what that's kind of showing you is that these events, while they may be infrequent, when it does rain, that rain is going to be heavier, and that has implications for stormwater management and flooding and slips and things like that. So yeah, the unintuitive part is that while we're expecting more drought, we're also expecting more kind of extreme heavy rainfall events. And in general, a lot of the climate change impacts that come out of this modeling it's kind of an exacerbation of what we already see, but kind of more extreme in the future. So you get these wild swings between drought and then flooding and things like that. So that's the kind of thing that we're seeing with the projections. Now, I have very limited time, so I just thought I'd quickly touch on sea level rise because Kaipara is obviously a very coastal district, and sea level rise will be something to consider into the future as well. And once again, like we talked about the different scenarios, the extent of sea level rise will depend on what the future greenhouse gas concentrations will be like. And by the end of the century, we're looking anywhere between 0.5 meter to 1.5 meter in terms of sea level rise. Now, for those that may be unfamiliar with sea level rise predictions, the reason we are expecting sea level has already risen and why we're expecting it to continue rising, most of it's not because there's additional kind of water being added to the ocean. It's due to what's called thermal expansion. So a liquid, in this case the ocean, when it's warm, it takes up more space. So even if you didn't add any more water to the ocean, because the ocean warms, it actually expands and takes up more space. So that is why we're expecting sea level rise. And the warmer the temperatures, the more warmer the oceans and the more sea level rise you have. So that's the kind of the background to a lot of sea level rise projections. I have screamed through that, but that is the end of my presentation. I was hoping to give you just a little taste of the kind of information that is now available to the community and your whānau and your businesses and everything like that as part of this project. And I hope it wasn't too gloom and doom, because I'd really like to, I guess, emphasize that there is a lot of opportunity, and it's very great that this kind of information was identified by the Kaipara team and the district as important for the district to have, because now that you have this information, you're able to make better decisions potentially. So I hope you find the information useful, and it's certainly been a real pleasure to work on this project. I'm going to pass on the baton to Malcolm, who will talk about soils.
How's that looking?
Looks good to me.
Welcome.
Tonight I'm going to be talking about the soils of the Kaipara District. And to put it into context, Northland's relatively stable. And what that means is that there's a long time for the soils to weather. And what that means is that most of the soils are clayey. That's because you've got all these sand and silt particles, and with rain, etc., they can become quite clayey. One of the things about clayey soils are that they often can restrict soil drainage. So perhaps not all the soils are really well drained. They might be moderately well drained or imperfectly drained, and down on the flats, obviously, they're poorly drained. But the other thing too is, if the soils are clayey, then the erosion products, and they're deposited as alluvium, they'll also be clayey, because that's all there is. You'll see that in the report we've talked about soil terrains, and really there's three soil terrains which are most useful, and they're the downlands from sedimentary rocks, and then there's floodplains and the sand country. So this is what the downlands from the sedimentary rocks looks like. Quite rolling, really, and you can see quite suitable for a range of uses. And on the top right, here's a couple of soils that you might find in these downlands from sedimentary rocks. The one at the top is a Warkworth soil, and it's pretty clayey. The roots can get down though. There's no impediments for the roots to get down. They'll go down the cracks. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, here's another soil, and it's not quite as good as the top soil in the picture there. And you could find those soils anywhere in the downlands, really, and there's a lot more soils as well. Here's the floodplains around Ruawai. You'll probably know more about those soils than I will. Very level, and you can see in the top right-hand corner, there's a soil profile. So you can see the dark topsoil there, and then the clayey material underneath. Gee, I love this picture from Google Earth, and it really outlines the sand country. So you can see the forestry area. That's perhaps the more recent sand dunes, and then around the lakes there, you can see, well, those are actually older sand dunes, and right out towards the river mouth and coast, there's much older sand dunes there too. So there's a whole range of sand dunes moving in from the west coast. And here we go. Here's some pictures of the sand. The one on the left is under the pine trees there, and this is the land or the soil that Brent's mentioned that they've included, but you've got to be a bit more careful with it because there's not a lot to hold it together, and it can easily erode. But there's quite a lot of that soil material. You can see the dark topsoil there, and then there's not a heck of a lot of soil development under. In the middle is the Red Hill soils. Gee, these are beautiful soils. You can see the topsoil there, and then those reddish brown colours underneath, lightly fried with butter. These would be really good soils. And once again, roots can explore all the way down there, and they're absolutely magnificent soils. Whereas on the right, here we've got the really old sand dunes, and you can see, oh yes, there's a topsoil here, and then there's a grey horizon, and all the nutrients have been leached out of there, and so that's mainly quartz sand, not very many nutrients at all. And then that dark brown horizon below it, you can see the material has been leached from that grey layer and deposited lower down. So there's a lot of it, organic matter and iron and aluminium in there. And then that sits on top of the old sand dune material, and it's really firm. So roots will only go really down to that brown layer. Another thing I've talked about in our report is drainage class, and we look at grey colours and those rusty brown colours to tell us and inform us about the drainage class, and we look at the amount and depth of those grey colours. The trouble is the signals come from unmodified soil, so where it's been drained, we can only really report on what the original soil would have been rather than what it is now in terms of drainage class. Now we come to a profile available water, so hold on tight here, and I'm pretty nervous too, because we've got Brent Clothier here, who's the world leading soil physicist. But anyway, in the report, we refer to these tensions of -10, -100, or -15 kPa. That's kilopascals. And just to put that in context, a car tire's got 220 kPa, and that's a pressure, whereas these other things, they're negative, so the suctions. And those suctions, they're caused by the pores or the holes in the soil. There's a lot of them. Soils can be over 50% holes, and generally they are, and they might be up to 70% holes. But you can imagine that the big holes don't have much suction. Perhaps think of a bucket, that's a big hole with some water in it. And the water doesn't rise up in the bucket at all. But the little holes, perhaps think of a syringe needle, or a very fine piece of hose like that, then there's more suction in there, capillary rise. So after rain, the big holes, they drain really fast, but the little holes, not so fast. And we say that 24 hours after heavy rain, the soils drain down to -10 kPa, so -10 kilopascals. So there's still a lot of water in them. The plants, they grow well from that -10 to, say, -100 kPa, and then they struggle right up to a much higher tension of -1500 kPa, and then we say that they die. And so the amount of water stored in a soil profile, we calculate from those suctions of -10 to -1500 kPa. Another thing that I talk about is pH, and it's a measure of the alkalinity of the soil or the acidity of the soil. And just to remind you that pH 7, it's neutral. But the soils become more acid with time, and they might become 4.5 to 6. And that's important because the pH affects the availability of the nutrients. So if you've got a pH of around 4.5, then not as many nutrients will be available to the plant. However, liming, if you put on lime, that brings the pH up to closer to 7, so where most of the nutrients are available to the plant. The trouble is, it's hard for lime to penetrate to depth. Generally, we sprinkle it on the topsoil, and it might affect the topsoil, but it's unlikely to affect the subsoil unless we use the mechanical means to get it down there. I'd like to delve a little bit into the history of the soil map. They were made about 1957, probably 1954. Soils of Northland were started, and perhaps finished early 60s, perhaps. And I guess when we're mapping soils, we'd use different methods today. In the past, in the 1950s, there was a lot of emphasis on the rock from which the soils were derived, and you could see those sedimentary downlands, or the alluvial ones, or the sand country soils. And then on top of those rocks, they said, well, there's a weathering sequence, and and you can see that in those pictures of the soils that I've shown you. But under one particular soil name, you could have, say, 4 to 5 different soils. And that's a bit of a problem to us these days. So today, if the soils are present, then we want to show them. And if we can't because of scale considerations, we'd like to give a landscape position. So we'd say, well, soil A occurs on ridge crests, and soil B on the side slopes, and soil C perhaps down in the narrow valleys. But back in the early 50s, they just said, well, this is the soil, and here's a whole range of properties. And that gets me to the scale of mapping. Originally, the soils were mapped at inch to the mile, 163,360, and you can see here I've photocopied off an original topo map that we had in our cabinets, and you can see you can't show a heck of a lot of stuff there, and especially back in the day when they didn't have very good access, etc. So what I'm saying is that we can't use the soil maps at more detail than that. And just to put it in context again, if we were mapping a farm today, we'd probably use a scale of about 1 to 10,000, which is much more detailed than the old inch to the mile. So use the soil maps with caution, and if you're really keen, then get site-specific information. So thanks very much. That's most of what I've got to say.
Thanks, Malcolm. We'll jump to Brent to talk about the crops. And just to anyone that's joining, first of all, hello, thank you. And if you have any questions, just pop them in the comments, and we will be taking questions at the end of our presentation as well.
Kia ora tātou, Pomaria i te whānau. I presume that's gone up and can be seen? Cool. Okay, it was very good that the Mayor, Dr. Smith, introduced this by noting that some 15 years or so ago, there was a study in Hokianga and the far north that included the Potu Peninsula on crop suitability. So where they left off, we have begun. In those 15 years, there's been quite a change in the kind of stuff that Nava's talked about, and the kind of stuff that Malcolm's talked about, and the kind of stuff that we do in terms of understanding crops, new techniques, new methods, and new knowledge. So I'd like to take you through where we sort of started at the same place where they left off and how we've advanced that since then. So if we go to the next slide, if I can, here we go. So we started off, we did first thing we did was a geographic information system sweep, a GIS sweep of the potential for generic horticulture and arable cropping. Where do we think that horticulture in general and arable cropping in general could happen across the Kaipara District? And so then we next carried out a detailed assessment of suitability for 6 crops. That was part of the project, that we would look at 6 crops. And I see we're going to have a question coming up on why these 6 crops were chosen. I will leave that to question time to explain why they were. And so we wrote our first report on the GIS sweep, then we wrote a second report on the first 3 of those crops, and then another report on the second crops that were essentially arable crops, sorghum, soybeans and peanuts. And finally, in conjunction with Nava and her team, we had a consideration of the impact of climate change on these crops in particular and other crops in general. So, what about a broad GIS sweep of what we could grow for horticulture? Well, horticulture generally needs pretty good soil, and taking information from Manaki Whenua and Malcolm and his teams around land use capability classes, we said for horticulture you need soils with pretty low levels of limitation, LUC classes 1 to 3. We did throw in there classes 4 to 7 in terms of soil limitations, that S limitation, because if you're a wine connoisseur, you'd know that the gimlet gravels are a bony, gravelly soil on the outskirts of Hastings, and they have a soil limitation, but they're fantastic for grapes and other horticultural crops. So that's why we put 4S and 7S in there. And also to include, because of our knowledge that, as Malcolm outlined, where there are some sandy soils, potentially they're very good for horticulture, as long as you mitigate and understand the erosion potential, that E subclass 4 to 8. So there you can see we have a map of there's no class 1, class 2, 3, 4S through to 6S, plus the 4E to 8E. But also, if you're involved in horticulture, you can't really work on steep lands. There's a lot of trafficking, there's a lot of action inside the orchard. So you really need slopes less than 15 degrees. So we added in a map of slopes less than 15 degrees. And also you need a certain amount of warmth, growing degree days. Every time the day temperature, average day temperature reaches above a base of 10 degrees, we add it in. And for crops to reach, for horticultural crops to reach fruit maturation, you need the growing degree days to be over 800 degree days. That's not a problem in the Kaipara District. You can see it's 1800 to 2000, and so there's a lot of warmth in Northland even today. So just for future reference, because I'll come back to this later on, you'll see that most of the Kaipara District has above 1800 growing degree days, and some have above 2000. And also you need a frost-free period. These are considerations that are normal for horticulture. You don't want a frost after flowering in spring, and you don't want a frost before fruit harvest in late summer, autumn. So you need a frost-free period, not a problem in the Kaipara District. So when we add all of those, we overlay all of those GIS layers together, we come up with this map. And it says in the Kaipara District, there's about 61,000 hectares spread across here. We've highlighted the ones that where wind erosion is necessary. So you can see there is a large amount of land that is suitable for horticulture there. There are some constraints, and I'll talk about those later, but there's some 20% of the district's lands that could be in high value horticultural crops. So then what we did next is we took NIWA's virtual climate station network, which is on a 5 by 5 kilometre grid, and it was going to be a heck of a lot of work if we did it across the whole region. So we chose some representative regions and chose 6 VCSN stations in the north, Waipawa, and then down to Pautu and over into Magnify, and in between around Ruawai and Dargaville. And we had a look with NIWA's VCSN network. They provide daily weather information for those VCSN stations. That you would have seen them in Nava's sweep when she went down from the 250 kilometre grid squares right down to that woven grid across New Zealand at 5 by 5 kilometres. And so we get records of weather for those stations between 1972 and 2020. And so here are some of the answers, and we've got more detailed reports, more detailed information. So you can see that olives are already grown over at Magnify. There are other areas where olives could be grown. They need deep free draining soils, and as Malcolm had noted, there are some drainage impediments, and so there's an issue there. I won't go into detail here, but I will in this next, because avocados require pretty similar conditions to olives, and there's quite a move by the industry body Avocados New Zealand to increase the area of production. They have quite a large and ambitious plan of increasing the area of avocado growing and making the industry a $100 million industry by 2025. And so here you can see some avocados from our plant and food research station in Kerikeri, where the soils, like Malcolm says, they're clayey, they've got a poorly drained base, but they do have a sort of a 40 centimetre section of the topsoil profile that is reasonably friable, describing those holes that Malcolm described. And so if you take the soil from the interrow and mound it into the row, you take a soil that has a 40 centimetre depth of soil into an 80 centimetre. So mounding of soil is one way to mitigate the issues around poor drainage and provide runoff into the interrow where it's now on that clay base and runs away, and keeps the root zone free draining and aerated. So there's quite a few areas that are suitable for avocados. And also we considered hops, hemp and CBD cannabis. These all belong, they're all cousins, they all belong in the Cannabaceae family. So we treated hops, hemp and CBD cannabis as one grouping. Multiple uses, of course, hops into beer, hemp into fibre, and CBD cannabis increasingly into pharmaceuticals. One of the key things for these crops is the day length and the growing degree days, and the Kaipara District Council area Rohe is very suitable. Because it's a bit warmer and quite humid, there will be need for pest and disease control, and again mitigation options around poor draining soils. One thing we were less enthusiastic about for hops is they grow, and you can see the photo there, they grow on 5 and 6 metre trellises. They're not a vine, they're called a bine. A vine has tendrils that hold on to strings. A bine is where the main stem actually wraps itself around and climbs up to the sky, and they form cones, and it's the cones, the little flowers that we like in our beer, and they can be for flavour and they can be for bitterness. And we just also add there are certain rules, domestic rules about requirements for growing CBD cannabis. So then we did a GIS suite for generic arable. Arable farming, we think we can include class 4 land now, because the limitations that you might have for horticulture are a little bit less for arable. So we included LUC classes 1 to 4, and again we threw in some of those erosion prone soils with the caveat rider that in fact they are erosion prone, and so there will have to be special care for their management and how you manage rotations. And also because of the mechanisation and trafficking, you need slopes less than 15 degrees. And so what we said then is that actually there's about 130,000, oops, I've missed out the hectare. Oh, now I've added an S on the end of it. So there's 130,000 hectares suitable for generic arable cropping. And that gives you a map of where that would be. So you can see there's quite a bit of land on both sides of the Potu Peninsula, plus around Dargaville and right down to Ruawai and over towards Magnify. And then we took the VCSN data, and here we looked at the VCSN data, and as Nava had mentioned, we have a good understanding of what's called the phenology. How do crops grow? When can you plant them? When do they emerge? When do they flower? When do the grains mature? And so we did that for sorghum, soybeans and peanuts, and there has been some questions around how we chose those, and I'm happy to explain, answer those in question time. So sorghum, actually, funnily enough, in the 1970s and 80s, sorghum there was a lot of trials going on in Northland. And again, because as Nava pointed out, drought is very common in Northland. And so a deeper rooted crop like sorghum was seen to be able to provide a far greater feed source than would be expected from shallow rooted pasture and dry summers. Not surprisingly, those early trials found out that the production of sorghum was greater on soils with greater water holding capacities, and Malcolm's explained what he means by greater water holding capacity. There is a possibility of growing sorghum for grain, but you'd have to be careful in the cultivar, the varieties you chose, because you'd need an early maturity cultivar, because most sorghum crops like a little bit warmer weather. So today, an early maturity cultivar would be important, and if you're going to grow it for grain, it's probably not worth it because you're more likely to get a higher grain yield off made. But certainly for green feed and silage, you can get a lot of production, and we give some of those figures in our reports. Soybeans. Soybeans could be a very useful rotation crop, and so with kumara, sorghum potentially, pasture, and even peanuts. Having that rotation is very important in terms of pest and disease control, that through rotations you eliminate that persistence of diseases, and you enable through rotation soil restoration through pasture, and then going into the arable crops in between. Just one warning here, that many of the modern soybean crops are American and they are GM, genetically modified, so there'll have to be a judicious choice of cultivar in terms of what would be happening in our GM-free New Zealand. And just to finish off, peanuts. Peanuts require warm, free draining soils with deep potential rooting depths, and there was a trial, a very small trial in the early 80s in Northland. And so when you see those words there, free draining, warm, relatively deep soils, the Poto Peninsula stands out as a likely candidate. And notwithstanding, there'll be some need to protect from wind erosion. And here's some even better news. As this project was beginning off, Plant and Food were engaged with another partner, Mr. Pick's Peanuts, and so there is a sustainable farming, sustainable food and fibre futures project through MPI on peanuts has begun. The project approval came a bit late for last summer, but we've already planted 6 cultivars of peanuts in our glasshouse in Hawke's Bay, and we're starting to develop that phenological understanding. How much warmth do these cultivars need, and how long do they take to mature? And so our plan now is that we will be planting a field trial of peanuts somewhere on the Poto Peninsula in October this year, because they do need warm soils for germination. And so, as Nava mentioned, future climates, some good news and some cautious news. Kaipara is going to be consistently warmer. There's going to be something like more than 200 and 300 growing degree days on average, remembering that there's already about 2,000 growing degree days in that region. So there's going to be something like 10 to 15% more growing degree days by the 2050s. And so some crops, warm crops, as I mentioned, around cultivar selection, there's going to be the potential to grow crops that are currently marginal there, so we can move into a wider range of subtropical cultivars and possibly even start to consider tropical crops. A little bit of a downside in terms of, say, something like olives, is that some olives, well, many olives actually, have winter chilling requirements. Winter is the thing that tells these deciduous perennial tree crops they have to sit there and accumulate enough chilling, and as the days lengthen they work out that winter's finished and it's about time they break bud and begin the flowering process. And so winter chilling is important. And so some of the crops that we're growing there now in terms of perennial tree crops, with winter chilling requirements, we might have to consider different cultivars, and there's a wide range of cultivars. So there's some caution there, but there's a lot of opportunities to choose crops that don't have those winter chilling requirements. So thank you very much, Paumarie. I'm happy to answer any questions that will, I think, be directed through Nava.
Thank you, Brent. There was actually one question that popped up on Facebook during your talk, and perhaps you can answer it in a couple of sentences. What are arable crops?
That's a very good question. There is an industry body called the Foundation for Arable Research, and I will take their definition of an arable crop, which is it's a crop that can be harvested by a combine harvester. So sorghum I have called an arable crop because you would harvest it with a combine harvester, but you could also grow it for silage and it would be ensiled. So technically it is an arable crop, but the process might be that you don't actually harvest it in that way.
Thank you. All right, we've got a bit of time for a few more questions. So if you do have a question, pop it into the comments on Facebook, but we have had some questions come in ahead of time as well. So one of those was for each of us. So in our experience, have we found any particular major or standout differences in the Kaipara District compared to other areas in New Zealand? So in terms of climate, soil and horticulture. And I guess I'll just go first. In terms of climate, New Zealand is a very long, and I guess we cover a big latitude difference there. So the climate in Kaipara is certainly one of the warmest places in the country, and that does vary quite significantly. And so, yeah, the challenges here can be different to other parts of the country. But perhaps Brent or Malcolm, you can jump in about soils and horticulture.
I could possibly just add one there, Nava, is that you would have seen that was a sort of a couple of things I mentioned early on about that generic sweep for horticulture was completely irrelevant for Kaipara. Was, do you have enough growing degree days? Is there a long enough frost-free period? Now that is critical when we do these kind of analyses for other parts of New Zealand, like the South Island or cooler parts of the North Island. So yeah, as Nava says, we're a very diverse country in terms of our climate, and I'm sure Malcolm will tell us about how diverse our soils are.
Yes, I think it'd be fair to say that the soils, apart from on the Potu Peninsula, are very clayey, and they do have drainage restrictions. So I think we need to be a bit careful there for plants which are not tolerant to having wet feet, but as Brent said, there are ways of overcoming that and mounding. And the other thing is that on the Potu Peninsula, there are these large areas of soils from the sandy dunes, and there's a range of soil properties within there. You can see in the forestry areas, you know, there's you've got to mitigate against erosion, and then on the very old soils, it's pretty hard to get roots down through those pans. So those would be the main differences, I think, is that the soils are clayey, and that often leads to drainage restrictions, which we need to overcome.
Thanks, Malcolm. A question on Facebook has come in. Good question. Why were the 6 crops chosen, and are there any others that have potentials but didn't make the top 6? For example, kiwi fruit, which was actually, I remember the early discussions, we discussed kiwi fruit extensively. So perhaps Brent, you can answer that question.
Sure. Look, that's a very good question, and of course, with kiwi fruit, winter chilling is going to be a big issue. But that's a sideline. How we develop the 6 crops. Malcolm, Nava and I travelled to Dargaville in September, or was it last year, something like that, and we had a meeting with Joseph from Grow Northland, or I forget the name of the economic development agency there, and also with Di and a whole crew from the Provincial Growth Fund project on Kickstart Kaipara. And at that meeting, we developed a big whiteboard and crops and sort of did a sort of an analysis of sort of a sort of kind of a Delphi approach to look at the first 3 crops, and that's how we came up with avocados, olives, hemp, hops, and CBD cannabis. Then we worked with Tim Morris of Coriolis and looked at complementarity with existing land uses of new crops in terms of rotations and stuff like that. And so with Tim and his knowledge and his connectedness, we came up with second 3. And that doesn't have to end there, of course, but that was the nature of the job, and that's why we're here now, is sort of at the tail end of the job with those 6. There are others that we could consider, and maybe, Nava, if you're willing, I could go to that next question, and that's on the written list here. It says, what about other organisations or research around this in New Zealand? So we're working with Maori entities, we're working in post-quake Kaikoura, we're working with Taranaki, and their crop selection requirements are quite different from those in Kaipara, obviously. And so we're looking at a range of crops, and so this need not necessarily be the end, but this got us a long way very quickly.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that if you look at the report that was done by Tim Morris and Coriolis Research, they looked at market feasibility of a much larger range of crops, which are potentially also viable. We needed to do a really deep dive, and so the limit was on 6, but that certainly doesn't mean that these are the only 6 that are the best. We consider them to be the best because of the various things that Brent described, but that doesn't mean that the limit is there. All right, another question. So, yeah, you kind of jumped into this a little bit, Brent. So one of the questions was, are we finding that more councils around New Zealand are commissioning in these district-specific research like this? And from the NIWA perspective, I would say absolutely. Traditionally, because of the limitations of the data and information, a lot of the information we used to do was quite national or district specific or regional type information was quite coarse, and so we couldn't give a lot of detail. And so I guess the advancements of science in general in terms of climate information has made it possible to have this kind of district level or tailored information, and that's a lot richer in terms of decision making, instead of trying to see, well, what does it mean for me, and looking at national scale information. There's definitely a big demand for this tailored information in terms of the climate side. So perhaps the others can add on from their experiences.
Yeah, I'd just like to support that. And if you go back, I don't know how many years, 20 years, you have the Grow Southland initiative. You had, Topo South, and you had Grow Otago. As the Mayor mentioned, we had the Hokianga Far North process. We didn't have virtual climate station network at that time. We didn't have that phenological information at that time. So now, as Nava's saying, we can do a deep dive at a higher spatial resolution with better information. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think our soil information's being pushed out through our online SMAP, and there's a lot of information in there, and but it's not site specific. So once again, people have got to treat they're not farm maps, I guess I'm saying.
I think that's an interesting point, Malcolm, and that is the next step. Whereas yes, this is a desktop exercise that's got us a long way, but there's still that final step on ground truthing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, another question. I live in I live in Magnify. Where did it go? Here it is. I live in Magnify and already grow avocados and olives, but have recently purchased more land to grow another crop. Which of the 6 crop mentions would you recommend to start growing in the next season? So, Brent, perhaps you can look into your magic 8-ball and.
Well, look, yeah, the really thing is, look, and this one of the limitations on land use change is knowledge, and so we're facing quite a strong learning curve on soybean, sorghum, peanuts. Whereas if you think of a farmer in North Carolina, they are so far up the experience curve, they know how to do these things. And so I suppose if I reflect back to your question there, if you know avocados and if you know olives, then there are industry bodies who provide. There's peak industry bodies who provide that sort of oversight. Avocados New Zealand, Jen Schooler and her crew through Avocados New Zealand have an ambitious plan to build the industry. So diversification is a good thing, but knowledge is a powerful thing. So if you already know how to do avocados and olives, I would say that's fine. And if you've got a little bit of land somewhere to the side, then have a bit of an experimentation with that. But I'd say take what you know and build on it.
All right. Straight into another question. So, are there plans to look at organic, as it is a huge emerging market? And I know that Tim looked a bit into organics, and perhaps this is something you can comment on, Brent, in terms of your other projects. Have you seen an increased demand in that kind of thing?
Look, yes, there is. There is, and there's a convergence, and so what is the difference from today's production systems and organics? And so I like to refer to today's production systems as being contemporary, because I think referring to them as conventional does not highlight the fact that they're still doing new things. So we have contemporary practices and organic practices, and we're seeing the emergence now of what is called regenerative agriculture. So I think we're seeing a convergence of organics, regenerative, and contemporary practices, and it's about understanding the whenua, the land, protecting it, and not degrading our soil resources, our water resources, and extracting higher value from our land. Our land's a finite resource, and so we have to put it to high value uses, and the word value can imply social, economic, cultural, and environmental. And that's a community, that's a landowner and a community approach.
Thank you. Another question. East Kaipara is quite different to Dargaville and Poto Peninsula. What studies and results have been specific to Kaiwaka and Magnify?
Magnify, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about the project as a whole and you can jump in there, Brent, but as part of this project, there's a lot of maps that were done. So you can see the kind of spatial differences in a lot of the soils, the climate, and the cropping information. So there has been that focus in the project. As we mentioned before, there's still limitations. It's not farm scale, or you might have some sort of differences where you are. But we have made that information available so that you can see, tailor it to your area.
Yeah, that's a good point, Nava. And so if you look at Kaiwaka and Magnify, there is not so much flat land, but there are niche pockets of flat land. And so if you consider something, and I'll go back to that avocados and olives, if you have distributed across that land around Kaiwaka and Magnify, you could have pockets of land. You could have 2 hectares of olives here, 5 hectares there, 10 hectares there. These in sum, possibly across different land titles, could sustain an industry that would lead to sort of an olive press somewhere. And so for the horticultural side of things, you don't need contiguous horticultural land. In the case of arable, more so, but not so much in horticulture. So if you have the example of this would be the private company Mr. Apple in the Hawke's Bay. They have 20 orchards, they have a range of cultivars, they share equipment, and they have a common packhouse cool store. So yeah, there are niche pockets of high value land that can be put to very good uses in some.
Yes, in fact, those landscape photographs that I took of the sedimentary downlands on sedimentary rock, yeah, they are from around Kaiwaka. So, as Brent says, yes, there are these pockets of land in there which are quite suitable, but we must also remember that there are a range of soils within those soil terrains, and we need to be really specific on where the good soils are.
And a good follow-up question to that, one for you, Malcolm, has come in saying, are there plans to get SMAP for the Kaipara District, or at least get soils mapped to 1 in 10,000 for the district?
There's no plans for 1 to 10,000 because that's a lot of work, and so we'd probably target that to defined areas where we think there's a high probability of having really good soils. And as for SMAP, currently SMAP online doesn't cover the northern region, but I think that there is a lot of soil data available from LIRIS Land Resource Inventory Survey, and if people type LIRIS into the Google search engine, then you can certainly find the basic soil information there.
Thank you. Another question, probably for me, saying, where did it go?
Is that Carly's one?
Yeah. So can we look forward to better water supplies through summer and grow? I'm growing pineapple successfully in Dargaville. Good on you. Just one plant, but it's thriving. So if in terms of rainfall projections for summer, I guess I'd put my NIWA hat on and say one of the things that we produce for the country nationally is the seasonal climate outlook, which goes out 3 months. And so if you're interested in projections that are kind of longer range, that resources available online, and we do a live stream kind of like this on our Facebook. We update information once a month, and we do that on our Facebook. So there's more of a discussion about projections. Now that is an outlook for the next 3 months, and obviously summer is a bit beyond that. But one thing that we're currently watching in terms of the summer ahead is the possibility of a La Nina. And for the Kaipara District, generally that means more northeasterly winds, and that can actually bring a wetter summer to northern areas of the country. So that's just something that's on our radar right now. That's certainly not the official prediction or anything like that, but that's the kind of thing as climate scientists and forecasters that we're watching quite closely. So yeah, if you want to keep up to date, there's a lot of resources that NEMA makes available and that we update every month. So, did you want to jump in, Brent?
Nava, yes, could I just add one thing there to Carly's question? And I was so pleased to see Minister Shane Jones and the development in Northland around so I wouldn't say guaranteed, I would say around better water supply. Look, just a simple take-home message here is that for reasons that I won't go into the detail of, the water requirements for a horticultural crop are about 1/4 to 1/3 of pasture. So in terms of making water go further, whereas you don't irrigate the whole area with horticultural crops, they're deciduous. You only need water for a short period of time between flowering and fruit ripening. And so the net water requirements for perennial trees and vines are about 1/4 to 1/3 of pasture.
So that's in response to if Kaipara gets water storage like they're talking, will this increase what can be grown in the area with guaranteed water supply?
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're out of time. So plenty of questions there. I think if you are going to watch this after the fact and pop questions down, then Kaipara District Council will probably get in touch with us so we can still answer questions after the fact, but not live. So thank you to everyone that has joined us, and thank you to Malcolm and Brent for your insight into this project. And yeah, it's been a great journey. It's been a real privilege to work with amazing scientists in these other organizations, and I hope that all of the resources that we've provided are useful to you.
Thanks, Nava.
Thank you.
May I just come back in here? Thank you, Nava. Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Malcolm, for this extraordinary presentation that you've done. It is so absolutely exciting. Everything that you've done here gives us an evidence base for the future, and it's looking out decades and decades into the future, as well as what is happening for the immediate spring ahead. I, for one, am really looking forward to doing a deep dive into those written documents that you've indicated, the background behind this kind of, if you like, this skim across the surface, wonderful presentation you've done tonight. And I'd just like to congratulate you all for having done such extraordinary work here. That original topoclimate study that was done in the early 2000s it included the Poto Peninsula and down to Ruawai. And so it stopped halfway across Kaipara District. Yeah. And for us, with our extraordinary place, you had people here on the tonight asking questions from Magnify, from Kaiwaka, from Mangaturoto. Those areas were not in the original topoclimate study that was done for Kaipara. So one of our intentions with the Kaipara Kickstart work was to include all of Kaipara District in this important opportunity that you've presented. And we can certainly start to see the potential here, and the fruits of this are still out there for our future, and very much for us to grab as we build our great food bowl of Kaipara. I mean, growing Kai is in our name, and these tools that you've all been working on are just so extraordinary. I am very, very excited. The first time I've seen this stuff is tonight, and so I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank everyone in participating and watching this live and contributing their questions. We have a very passionate group of food producers all across Kaipara, and so it's great to have real engagement from everyone here tonight. So thank you again to our panel of experts, to Nava, Malcolm and Brent for your expert knowledge and for bringing so much to this extraordinary opportunity that we have. To everyone at home, thank you again for joining in. And I'd just like to close us down by saying kia kaha Kaipara, rise strong. We have extraordinary opportunities ahead, and these building blocks, which are all freely available to us all now, are really set to make Kaipara District absolutely world-class as a food production area. And so I'm extremely happy with this. So thank you again, everyone. And I'll say good night there. So ka kite anō, we'll see you all again soon. And thank you very much and good evening.